Hello YouTube, my name is Neil and we are studying for the MCATs today. We're in the biology review, chapter 5, the endocrine system. Human beings consist of many trillions of cells that must work together to sustain life. Fuel resources must be conserved or used appropriately, such as during responses to stressful situations. In addition, organs must be able to communicate with the brain to cause a change in behavior and physiology to maintain homeostasis. Hormones, as the messengers in the endocrine system, play an essential role in this communication. For example, the pancreas produces both insulin and glucagon. Insulin favors the transport of glucose into organs as well as the storage of excess glucose when blood glucose concentrations are high. Conversely, glucagon triggers the release of sugar stores and raises blood glucose concentration. Working together, these hormones ensure that there is enough glucose available for organ function, but that glucose levels are not so high as to cause damage to organ systems. This is no inconsequential fact. Diabetes mellitus is one of the most common diagnoses in the United States and a major cause of morbidity and mortality. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is an autoimmune disease in which insulin-producing cells in the islets of Langerhans are destroyed. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is caused by end organ insensitivity to insulin. In both cases, blood glucose concentrations rise to dangerous levels, sometimes up to 10 times the normal concentration, and can cause significant damage to multiple organs, including the retina of the eye, the glomeruli of the kidneys, the coronary vessels of the heart, and cerebral vessels of the brain, and nerves in the extremities. Left untreated, or to be frank, even if treated in many cases, diabetes can lead to blindness, kidney failure, heart attacks, strokes, and amputation. Regardless of the field you enter, you will spend a significant amount of time working with diabetic patients, and will have to think about the effects of this diagnosis on other diagnoses and their treatment. In this chapter, we will explore the different types of hormones and how they work. We'll survey the various endocrine organs and discuss the hormones each one produces. This is an extremely high-yield chapter. The MCAT frequently tests not only the content of the endocrine system, the hormones and their functions, but also the reasoning of the endocrine system, feedback loops, and their regulation. Return to this chapter frequently during studying. A thorough knowledge of the system will assuredly pay off in points on test day. All right, the endocrine system consists of organs known as glands that secrete hormones. Hormones are signaling molecules that are secreted directly into the bloodstream to travel to a distant target tissue. At that tissue, hormones bind to receptors, inducing a change in gene expression or cellular functioning. Not all hormones share the same structure and function. In order to understand how each hormone functions, it is first important to understand basic hormone structure. Classification of hormones by chemical structure. Let's write down just glands. Make hormones. Classification of hormones by chemical structure. Hormones can be subdivided into categories based on different criteria. First, hormones can be classified by their chemical identities. Hormones can be peptides, steroids, or amino acid derivatives. Hormones can be peptide, steroid, or amino acid derivatives. Peptide hormones are made up of amino acids ranging in size from quite small, such as ADH, to relatively large, such as insulin. Peptide hormones are all derived from larger precursor polypeptides that are cleaved during post-translational modification. These smaller units are transported to the Golgi apparatus for further modification that activate the hormone and direct it to the correct location in the cell. Such hormones are released by exocytosis after being packaged into vesicles. Because peptide hormones are charged and cannot pass through the plasma membrane, these hormones must bind to an extracellular receptor. The peptide hormone is considered the first messenger. It binds to the receptor and triggers the transmission of a second signal, known as the second messenger. There are many different receptor subtypes, and the type of receptor determines what happens once the hormone has stimulated the receptor. Let's write down peptide hormones are charged. And so they exist in vesicles in the cell, exit by exocytosis. Charge, they bind to extracellular receptors. And it is the first messenger that will trigger a second messenger. All right. The connection between the hormone at the surface and the effect brought about by second messengers within the cell is known as signaling cascade. At each step, there is the possibility of amplification. For example, one hormone molecule may bind to multiple receptors before it is degraded. Also, each receptor may activate multiple enzymes, each of which will trigger the production of large quantities of second messengers. Thus, each step can result in an increase in the intensity of the signal. Some common second messengers are cyclic adenosine monophosphate, CAMP, inositol triphosphate, IP3, and calcium. Let's write these down. Signaling cascade, amplification, and some common second messengers are cyclic AMP, inositol, IP3. Oh, inositol triphosphate is IP3, my bad. Inositol, we're just going to put IP3. We're going to remember that that's inositol triphosphate. I wish there was a T in there. I wish it was IT3 instead of IP3. Anyways, and calcium. The activation of G protein-coupled receptor is shown in figure 5.1. In this system, the binding of a peptide hormone triggers the receptor to either activate or inhibit an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. Let's write all this down. G protein coupled receptor so the peptide hormone triggers adenylate cyclase, raising or lowering the levels of CAMP, cyclic AMP, accordingly. So peptide causes adenylate cyclase, which leads to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP can bind to intracellular targets such as protein kinase A, which phosphorylates transcription factors like cyclic AMP, which phosphorylates transcription factors like cyclic AMP response element binding protein, or CREB, to exert the hormone's ultimate effect. Keep in mind that protein kinase A can modify other enzymes as well as transcription factors, thus it can have a rapid or slow effect on the cell. So protein kinase A goes on to phosphorylate transcription factors. Like cyclic AMP response element binding protein. Cyclic AMP response element binding protein to exert the hormone's ultimate effect, right? Mechanism of action of a peptide hormone. So I guess this would be your G protein, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, protein kinase A, CREB. And it looks like CREB is what actually goes in and like activates a gene for expression. All right. The effects of peptide hormones are usually rapid but short-lived because these hormones act through transient second messenger systems. It is quicker to turn them on or off compared with steroid hormones, but their effects do not last without relatively constant stimulation. So let's also just write that this whole thing is short-lived effects. Because peptides are generally water-soluble, peptide hormones can travel freely in the bloodstream and usually do not require carriers. This is in stark contrast to steroid hormones, as we will explore in the next section. Note that they are water-soluble. Next, steroid. Steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. And are produced primarily by the gonads and adrenal cortex. Gonads, adrenal cortex. Because steroid hormones are derived from non-polar molecules, they can easily cross the cell membrane. In fact, their receptors are usually intracellular in the cystole or intranuclear in the nucleus. Upon binding to the receptor, steroid hormone receptor complexes undergo conformational changes. The receptor can then bind directly to DNA, resulting in either increased or decreased transcription of particular genes, depending on the identity of the hormone as shown in figure 5.2. One common form of conformational change is dimerization, or pairing of two receptor hormone complexes. The effects of steroid hormones are slower but longer lived than peptide hormones because steroid hormones cause alterations in the amount of mRNA and protein present in a cell by direct action on DNA. All right. Let's write that there. Non-polar. So they cross membranes, both the cell and nuclear membrane. Conformational changes, i.e., dimerization. Or pairing, we'll just write pairing of receptor hormone complexes. Steroid hormones are not water soluble and thus must be carried by proteins in the bloodstream to be able to travel around the body. Some of these proteins are very specific and carry only one hormone, such as sex hormone binding globulin, while other proteins are non-specific, such as albumin. Note that hormones are generally inactive while attached to a carrier protein and must dissociate from the carrier to function. Levels of carrier proteins can change the levels of active hormone. For example, some conditions increase the quantity of a protein that carries thyroid hormones, thyroxine binding globulin, TBG. This causes the body to perceive a lower level of thyroid hormone because the increased quantity of TBG binds a larger portion of the hormone, meaning there's less free hormone available. Okay. Not water soluble. So they have to bind to proteins, hormone binding proteins, carried by proteins like hormone binding globulin, albumin, and thyroxine binding globulin. All right, amino acid derivative hormones. Finally, amino acid derivative hormones are less common than peptide and steroid hormones, but include some of the most important hormones discussed in this chapter, including epinephrine, norepinephrine, triiodothyronine, and thyroxine. These hormones are derived from one or two amino acids, usually with a few additional modifications. For example, thyroid hormones are made from tyrosine with the addition of several iodine atoms. All right. Let's write down epinephrine, norepinephrine, which I understand is similar to epinephrine. I think it's just like epinephrine for, I don't remember which one's for the CNS, central nervous system, and which one's for the general body, the bloodstream, but epinephrine, norepinephrine, triiodothyronine, and thyroxine. All right. This chemistry of this family of hormones is considerably less predictable and is one of the few instances where overt memorization may be the best strategy. The catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, bind to G protein-coupled receptors, while the thyroid hormones bind intracellularly. All right, so one staying outside the cell, one going into the cell. So let's write down that these two bind to G that is not there, G protein coupled receptor, while thyroid hormones bind intracellularly. Intracellular. Classification of hormones by target tissue. Some hormones, known as direct hormones, are secreted and then act directly on a target tissue. For example, insulin released by the pancreas causes increased uptake of glucose by muscles. Other hormones, known as tropic hormones, require an immediate intermediary to act. For example, as discussed in Chapter 2, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. LH then acts on the gonads to stimulate testosterone production in the male and estrogen production in the female. GnRH and LH do not cause direct changes in the physiology of muscle, bone, and hair follicles. Rather, they stimulate the production of another hormone by another endocrine gland that acts on these target tissues. Tropic hormones usually originate in the brain and anterior pituitary gland, as these structures are involved in coordinating of multiple processes within the body. There's a direct hormone versus tropic hormone. And over here in the over here we're going to put insulin. Over here we're going to put GnRH. Leads to luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. All right. Before you move on, compare and contrast peptide and steroid hormones based on the following criteria. Chemical precursor. Peptide hormones are made out of peptides. Steroid hormones, I believe, are made out of cholesterol. Location of receptor. Peptide hormones are usually outside of the cell, while steroid hormones can travel through the membrane, so their receptors can be on the inside. Mechanism of action. Because peptide hormones the receptors are usually outside the cell, they will cause a cascade or second messengers to act within the cell. Steroid hormones can, I think, directly act on right, steroid hormones, because they can go directly into like the nucleus even, but they still are going to complex with something to make like a functional like hormone, like a functional, I don't know, to cause gene transcription or something. But yeah, the steroid hormone is going to be involved in directly stimulating gene transcription. Method of travel in the bloodstream. Peptide hormones can travel freely. Steroid hormones need to be shepherded by carriers. Rapidness of onset. I guess peptides are fast but short-lived. Oh, there you go. Duration. Fast but short-lived. Steroids are slower and last longer. How are amino acid derivative hormones synthesized? Amino acid derivative hormones, I imagine, are derived from amino acids. Are derived from one or two amino acids, usually with a few additional modifications. What is the difference between a direct and a tropic hormone? Direct acts on the tissue directly. Tropic hormones will cause some other organ to make like a secondary hormone that goes and acts on the tissue. All right. Endocrine organs and hormones. The hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid and parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the gonads, testes and ovaries, and the pineal gland are all endocrine glands. As shown in figure 5.3, each of these organs is capable of synthesizing and secreting one or more hormones. Furthermore, there are collections of cells within organs such as kidneys, gastrointestinal glands, heart, and thymus that serve important endocrine roles. The organ in this second group are traditionally not called endocrine organs, but because hormone production is not their main function. So hormones can still be made in the heart, organs of other systems. All right. Nonetheless, let's write down some of these organs. Organs. Hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pancreas, gonads, and the pineal gland are all endocrine glands. All right. Now that we've discussed the mechanisms through which hormones act and their classification, we can discuss the individual endocrine organs and the hormones secreted by each. The hypothalamus. Let's begin with the hypothalamus, the bridge between the nervous and endocrine systems. By regulating the pituitary gland through tropic hormones, the hypothalamus is capable of having organism-wide effects. The hypothalamus is located in the forebrain, directly above the pituitary gland and below the thalamus, hence the name hypothalamus. Because the hypothalamus and the pituitary are close to each other, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary through paracrine release of hormones into a portal system that directly connects the two organs. The hypothalamus receives input from a wide variety of sources. For example, a part of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus receives some of the light input from the retina and helps to control sleep-wake cycles. Other parts of the hypothalamus respond to increases in blood osmolarity. Still other parts of the hypothalamus regulate appetite and satiety. Let's write down tropic hormones. Portal system to the pituitary. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. I want to remember that. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. Light, sleep, wake. Other parts respond to increase in blood osmolarity, appetite and satiety. All right. The release of hormones by the hypothalamus is regulated by negative feedback. Let's write that down. Negative feedback. Negative feedback occurs when a hormone or product later in the pathway inhibits hormones or enzymes earlier in the pathway. This type of feedback maintains homeostasis and prevents wasted energy by restricting production of substances that are already present in sufficient quantities. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland are inextricably linked. The pituitary gland has an anterior and posterior component, each with a unique interaction with the hypothalamus. We will discuss each in turn. Interactions with the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes compounds into the hypophyseal portal system. Hypophyseal portal system, which is a blood vessel system that directly connects the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary. Thus, hormones released from the hypothalamus travel directly to the anterior pituitary and can be found in appreciable concentrations in the systemic circulation. Note that the term hypophysis is an alternative term for the pituitary. Once hormones have been released from the hypothalamus into this portal bloodstream, they travel down the pituitary stalk and bind to receptors in the anterior pituitary, stimulating the release of other hormones. Hypophysis is an alternative term for the pituitary. Anterior pituitary or hypophysis. All right. The hypothalamus secretes several different tropic hormones. The following indicates each hormone released by the hypothalamus and the hormones released by the anterior pituitary in response. gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. Of course, we already know that this leads to your FSH and LH. Growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone. A hormone for another hormone. Should we just write GHRH? Leads to growth hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone leads to thyroid stimulating hormone. Corticotropin releasing factor. Corticotropin releasing factor leads to adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. All right. There's one exception to this pattern. Prolactin inhibiting factor, PIF, which is actually dopamine, is released by the hypothalamus and causes a decrease in prolactin secretion. So prolactin inhibiting factor will cut off in prolactin. Each of the tropic hormones then causes the release of another hormone from an endocrine gland that has negative feedback effects. For example, release of CRF from the corticotropin releasing factor from the hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, the adrenal corticotropic hormone. Will then cause the adrenal cortex to increase the level of cortisol being secreted into the blood. However, cortisol is detrimental when levels become too high. To prevent excess cortisol secretion, cortisol can inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary from releasing CRF and ACTH, respectively, as shown in figure 5.5. This makes sense because CRF and ACTH have already accomplished their desired effect, giving more cortisol into the blood. What does this mean in terms of receptors in the hypothalamus and in pituitary? Cortisol receptors must be present in these organs. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to recognize that cortisol levels had increased. 3 organ systems like these are commonly referred to as axes. For example, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, and so on. So let's make a little diagram here. We have CRF will stimulate ACTH, which will then lead to cortisol, and cortisol to prevent excess cortisol secretion, cortisol can inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary from releasing CRF and ACTH, respectively. All right, so cortisol leads to both cutoff of your CRF in the hypothalamus as well as ACTH by the anterior pituitary. Negative feedback. And let's also write down a couple axes here. the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. Interactions with the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not receive tropic hormones through the hypophyseal portal system. Rather, neurons in the hypothalamus send their axons down the pituitary stalk directly into the posterior pituitary, which can then release oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is a hormone that stimulates uterine contractions during labor, as well as milk let down during lactation. There is evidence that oxytocin is also involved in bonding behavior. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also called vasopressin, increases reabsorption of water in the collecting ducts of the kidney. ADH is secreted in response to increased plasma osmolarity or increased concentrations of solutes within the blood. So, posterior pituitary is stimulated by neurons, not by hormones coming from the hypothalamus. And an example is oxytocin. And antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin. Anterior pituitary. As described earlier, the pituitary gland, do we not get into it? Interactions with the anterior. Now we're actually going to talk about the pituitary itself. We'll go through the posterior as well. Anterior pituitary. As described earlier, the pituitary gland is divided into anterior and posterior sections. Because this distinction has already been covered, our discussion of the pituitary gland here will focus on the hormones released by each section. The anterior pituitary synthesizes and secretes 7 different products. 4 of these are tropic hormones, while the other 3 are direct hormones. So back to anterior. Seven hormones. We are going to mention the tropic hormones only briefly here. These hormones work by causing the release of another hormone at the organ level. Thus, we will discuss the tropic hormones in tandem with the endocrine organ on which they act. The release of both follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone is stimulated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. These 2 hormones act on the gonads, testes and ovaries. The release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is stimulated by corticotropin-releasing factor, CRF, from the hypothalamus. ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex. The release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, is stimulated by thyroid-releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. TSH acts on the thyroid. So we kind of wrote this down. We got the thyroid, we got the adrenal, and then of course we got the lactin. Maybe we don't need to write these down again. Direct hormones. Tropic stated earlier. Direct. Did we already go over all of these? Prolactin is more important in females than in males. It stimulates milk production in the mammary glands. Milk production in the male is always pathologic. During pregnancy, estrogen and progesterone levels are high. In addition, prolactin, a hormone that increases milk production, is also secreted by the anterior pituitary. Prolactin is an unusual hormone in that the release of dopamine and hypothalamus decreases its secretion. The release of dopamine from the hypothalamus decreases its secretion. So dopamine is that PIF, right? Is that what they said earlier as well? Which is actually dopamine. Yeah, we should put that in here. Dopamine. And let's make a little note that all of these are tropic, while this one is direct. Let me just double check that real quick. Is that what they said here? That GHRH is not here, so maybe it's not tropic. Or maybe it's from the posterior? Growth hormone. There you go. All right, we'll talk about it in a minute. I guess it is direct, probably. Let's correct this then. Tropic, direct, tropic. So that doesn't sound direct if it's causing growth hormone. I take that back. That can't be direct. It's just in a separate section. It does seem like it's in the direct hormone section. We'll get into it in a second. Direct hormones. Prolactin is more important in females than in males. It stimulates milk production in the mammary glands. How did we get through all of this? Milk production in the male is pathologic. During pregnancy, estrogen and progesterone levels are high. In addition, prolactin, hormone that increases milk production, is also secreted by the anterior pituitary. Prolactin is an unusual hormone in that the release of dopamine from hypothalamus decreases its secretion. The high levels of estrogen and progesterone allow for the development of milk ducts in preparation for lactation, but it is not only shortly after the expulsion of the placenta, when estrogen, progesterone, and dopamine levels drop, that the block on milk production is removed and lactation actually begins. Milk ejection occurs when the newborn infant latches onto the breast. Nipple stimulation causes activation of the hypothalamus, resulting in two different reactions. First, oxytocin is released from the anterior pituitary, resulting in contraction of the smooth muscle of the breast and ejection of milk through the nipple. Second, the hypothalamus stops releasing dopamine onto the anterior pituitary, which, as mentioned above, allows prolactin release, causing production of milk and regulation of the milk supply. All right, so let's write that down. Prolactin let's start with oxytocin. Causes smooth muscle contraction of the breast. And second, it also leads to the cessation of dopamine, which inhibits milk production, so its restriction allows milk production. Endorphins decrease the perception of pain. For example, after completing a marathon, many people will say they are on an endorphin high or rush. Endorphins mask the pain from just having run 26.2 miles and can even induce a sense of euphoria. Many pharmaceutical agents, such as morphine, mimic the effects of these naturally occurring painkillers. Endorphins decrease pain. Natural painkillers. Growth hormone is named for exactly what it does. It promotes the growth of bone and muscle. This sort of growth is energetically expensive and requires large quantities of glucose. Growth hormone prevents glucose uptake in certain tissues, those that are not growing, and stimulates the breakdown of fatty acids. This increases the availability of glucose overall, allowing the muscle and bone to use it. Growth hormone, GH, release is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, from the hypothalamus. So we did go over the GHRH-GH connection. So let's write down that GH prevents glucose uptake in non-bone muscle tissue and stimulates fatty acid breakdown. All right. Bone growth originates in special regions of the bone known as the epiphyseal plates. Epiphyseal plates, which seal shut during puberty. An excess of GH released in childhood before this closure can cause gigantism, and a deficit results in dwarfism. In adults, the situation is slightly different because the long bones are sealed. GH still has an effect, but is primarily in the smaller bones. The resulting medical condition is known as acromegaly. The bones most commonly affected are those in the hands, feet, and head. Patients with acromegaly tend to present to their doctors before they have had to buy larger shoes, cannot wear their rings, and can no longer fit into their hats. So their head and their feet get large. All right. But also I've heard that older, like, men particularly tend to have bigger noses and features because, like, most of your bones don't grow anymore, but cartilage, like your nose and your ears have cartilage, will still grow, and so those will become larger compared to your skull. Anyways, let's write down GH how should I put it? Imbalance GH leads to either gigantism, dwarfism, or acromegaly if it happens as an adult. Posterior pituitary. This is all anterior pituitary. Posterior. Posterior pituitary contains the nerve terminals of neurons with cell bodies in the hypothalamus. As mentioned earlier, the posterior pituitary receives and stores two hormones produced by the hypothalamus, ADH and oxytocin. We already wrote that up here anyways, didn't we? Anyways, oxytocin, ADH, or vasopressin. ADH is secreted in response to low blood volume as sensed by baroreceptors or increased blood osmolarity as sensed by osmoreceptors. As shown in figure 5.6, its action is at the level of the collecting duct, where it increases the permeability of the duct to water. The net effect is a greater reabsorption of water from the filtrate in the nephron. This results in greater retention of water, which results in increased blood volume and higher blood pressure. So receptors, low blood volume or high blood osmolarity can both be remedied with some more water. Will lead to ADH. Which will then cause the opposite effect, increased volume or decreased osmolarity. Oxytocin is secreted during childbirth and allows for coordinated contraction of uterine smooth muscle. Its secretion may also be stimulated by suckling, as it promotes milk ejection through contraction of smooth muscle in the breast. Finally, oxytocin may be involved in bonding behavior. Oxytocin is unusual in that it has a positive feedback loop. The release of oxytocin promotes uterine contraction, which promotes more oxytocin release, which promotes stronger uterine contractions, and so on. Positive feedback loops can usually be identified by this theme of a spiraling forward process and usually have a definitive endpoint, in this case, delivery. Let's just write oxytocin has a positive feedback loop. The thyroid is controlled by thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Now that I think about it, did I remember to put calcium up here as a signal? I don't know why I thought of that. Yeah, okay. Second messengers. All right. Thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Thyroid is on the front surface of the trachea. It can be palpated, felt, as an organ near the base of the neck that moves up and down with swallowing. The thyroid has two major functions: setting basal metabolic rate and calcium homeostasis. It mediates the first effect by releasing triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4, where calcium levels are controlled by calcitonin. So the thyroid hormone goes to the thyroid, which then makes triiodothyronine, which is T3, and thyroxine, which is T4. And calcium levels are controlled by calcitonin. So both T3 and T4 will affect your metabolic rate. All right. There we go. T3 and T4. Triiodothyronine, and thyroxine are both produced by the iodination of the amino acid tyrosine in the follicular cells of the thyroid. Let's write down follicular cells. Follicular cells. Sounds like follicles, right? The number 3 and 4 refer to the number of iodine atoms attached to the tyrosine. Thyroid hormones are capable of resettling the basal metabolic rate of the body by making energy production more or less efficient, as well as altering the utilization of glucose and fatty acids. Increased amounts of T3 and T4 will lead to increased cellular respiration. This leads to a greater amount of protein and fatty acid turnover by speeding up both synthesis and degradation of these compounds. High plasma levels of thyroid hormones will lead to decreased TSH and TRH synthesis. Negative feedback prevents excess secretion of T3 and T4, as shown in figure 5.7. So, increased T3, T4 will lead to increased cellular respiration. And also negative feedback. So leads to cellular respiration. And high T3, T4 also leads to low T3, T4. I guess we don't need to write that down. Negative feedback is exactly what we're talking about. A deficiency of iodine. Oh, let's write down that it's iodine also. Tyrosine plus iodine are let's do this. Both T3 and T4 are tyrosine plus iodine. And right, a deficiency of iodine or inflammation of the thyroid may result in hypothyroidism. Hypothyroidism, in which thyroid hormones are secreted in insufficient amounts or not at all. The condition is characterized by lethargy, decreased body temperature, slow respiratory and heart rate, cold tolerance, and weight gain. Thyroid hormones are required for appropriate neurological and physical development in children. Most children are tested at birth for appropriate levels because a deficiency will result in mental retardation and developmental delay. Cretinism. Interesting word. Cretinism is, I guess, the developmental delay part. Hypothyroidism is low T3, T4. Let's write down that cretinism. I hope I'm not saying that right. I hope that's not offensive to say cretinism. Cretinism is developmental delay. Calcitonin. If we were to examine thyroid tissue under a light microscope, we would see two distinct cell populations within the gland. Follicular cells produce thyroid hormones, and C cells, also called parafollicular cells, produce calcitonin. Calcitonin acts to decrease plasma calcium levels in three ways: increased calcium excretion from the kidneys, decreased calcium absorption from the gut, and increased storage of calcium in the bone. High levels of calcium in the blood stimulate secretion of calcitonin from the C cells. Let's write C cells or parafollicular make calcitonin and calcitonin causes decreased, let's start with increased calcium excretion. Let's shorten this a little bit, just calcium secretion in the kidneys, decreased calcium absorption in the gut, and increased calcium storage in the bones. And naturally, high calcium in the blood stimulates calcitonin production from the C cells. Parathyroid glands. The parathyroids are four small pea-sized structures that sit on the posterior surface of the thyroid. Posterior. The hormone produced by the parathyroid glands is aptly named parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone. PTH serves as an antagonistic hormone to calcitonin, raising blood calcium levels. Specifically, it decreases excretion of calcium by the kidneys, increases absorption of calcium in the gut via vitamin D, and increases bone reabsorption. Resorption is the way they put it, thereby freeing up calcium increases bone resorption. So not absorption, but releasing calcium, I guess, thereby freeing up calcium as shown in figure 5.8. Like the hormones we've already seen, PTH is also subject to feedback inhibition. As levels of calcium or plasma calcium rise, PTH secretion is decreased. Parathyroid hormone also affects phosphorus homeostasis by reabsorbing phosphate from bone and reducing reabsorption of phosphate in the kidney, thus promoting its excretion in the urine. Parathyroid. Antagonist to calcitronin. Antagonistic hormone. It's not an antagonist, a chemical antagonist in the literal sense, is it? Antagonist to calcitronin. So it has the opposite effect. And you'll note that calcium absorption requires vitamin D. Like the hormones we've already seen, subject to feedback inhibition. So negative feedback. As a result of calcium rise, PTH secretion is decreased. So negative feedback and we should note that it also affects phosphorus, not just calcium. Parathyroid hormone affects phosphorus homeostasis by resorbing phosphate from the bone. So it has the same effect on phosphorus that it does calcium. Phosphorus. I think just P is phosphorus, or is it pH? I think we have a handy little chart here. Is it P? It's just P. Is that even phosphorus? These don't have it written down, but it's got to be P, right? What else could P be? All right. Let's write that in. Phosphorus. Spelled phosphorus wrong. Or phosphates, rather. Phosphorus ions? What's a phosphate? Phosphate is like adenosine triphosphate. So phosphate is, yeah, 4 phosphorus in a complex, I think, right? PTH also activates vitamin D. Activates vitamin D, which is required for the absorption of calcium and phosphate in the gut. The overall effect of parathyroid hormone, therefore, is a significant increase in blood calcium levels with little effect on phosphate. The absorption of phosphate in the gut and its excretion in the kidney somewhat cancel each other out. Okay, so let's write greater effect on calcium than phosphorus. Adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys. Adrenal actually translates to near or next to the kidney. Perfect. Each adrenal gland consists of a cortex and a medulla. The adrenal cortex. Cortex plus medulla is the gland, I guess, not the cortex, but this distinction is more than anatomical. Each part of the gland is responsible for secretion of different hormones. The adrenal cortex secretes corticosteroids. These are steroid hormones that can be divided into three functional classes: glucocorticoids, mineral corticoids, and cortical sex hormones. Cortex makes corticosteroids like glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and cortical sex hormones. Glucocorticoids are steroid hormones that regulate glucose level. In addition, these hormones also affect protein metabolism. The two glucocorticoids most likely to be tested on the MCAT are cortisol and cortisone. Cortisol, cortisone. Did I spell that right? Yeah. These hormones raise blood glucose by increasing gluconeogenesis and decrease protein synthesis. Cortisol and cortisone can also decrease inflammation and immunologic responses. Cortisol is also known as a stress hormone because it is released in times of physical or emotional stress. This increases blood sugar and provides a ready source of fuel in case the body must react quickly to a dangerous stimulus. So let's write down that cortisol and cortisone increase gluconeogenesis and decrease protein synthesis. They can also decrease inflammation and immune All right, glucocorticoid release is under the control of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, as described earlier. Corticotropin releasing factor, CRF, from the hypothalamus promotes the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which promotes release of glucocorticoids and from the adrenal cortex. So let's write down that chain as well. CRF in the hypothalamus stimulates ACTH in the anterior pituitary, which then stimulates what was it? Glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. Cortex. Specifically the cortex. Mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids are used in salt and water homeostasis. Their most profound effects are on the kidneys. The most noteworthy mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, which increases sodium reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct of the nephron. Water follows the sodium cations into the bloodstream, increasing blood volume and pressure. Note that while the blood pressure increases, the plasma osmolarity remains unchanged, unlike with ADH. Aldosterone also decreases the reabsorption of potassium and hydrogen ions in these same segments of the nephron, promoting their excretion in the urine. So it brings water, doesn't bring ions. Let's write down that. Mineralocorticoids deal with salt and water. One of which is aldosterone, which is going to increase sodium reabsorption. Water follows the sodium, and so it increase in H2O in blood. Because the water follows the salt. Osmolarity is unchanged. It also increases the reabsorption of potassium and hydrogen. So in this case, reabsorption of salt means back into the blood, and reabsorption of potassium means into the kidney to be expelled. That is a little bit confusing, but we'll have to just remember reabsorption of potassium, not phosphorus. We were talking about phosphorus earlier. Potassium is K. And hydrogen, I guess K is also a plus, right? And nitrogen's plus, or sodium's plus. Phosphorus, I don't think. I think that's probably neutral. Calcium's a plus. We don't need to put pluses on all of them. It's not necessary. So reabsorption means into, so let's say increased absorption, reabsorption of K and H means into kidney. while this means into the blood. Right. Unlike the glucocorticoids, aldosterone is primarily under the control of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. As shown in figure 5.9, decreased blood pressure causes the juxtaglomerular Nice. Juxtaglomerular cells in the kidney to secrete renin. Where does it start? Decreased blood pressures. We start with low blood pressure leads to juxtaglomerular cells making renin, which cleaves an inactive plasma protein, angiotensin, to its active form. Makes angiotensin to become angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. So let's angiotensin converting enzyme does this step. In the lungs. So let's put lungs here, because we're already going from the kidneys to the lungs here. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. So angiotensin 2 causes aldosterone in the adrenal cortex. I'm going to forget what AC means. Adrenal. Once blood pressure is restored, there's a decreased drive to simulate renin release, thus serving as the negative feedback mechanism for the system. Negative feedback. Cortical sex hormones. Cortical sex hormones. The adrenal glands also make cortical sex hormones, androgens and estrogens. Because males already secrete large quantities of androgens in the testes, adrenal testosterone plays a small role in male physiology. Androgens and estrogens. Most of the androgens in males are made in the testes. Adrenal testosterone is not a big deal. However, females are much more sensitive to disorders of cortical sex hormone production. For example, certain enzyme deficiencies in the synthetic pathways of other adrenal cortex hormones result in excess androgen production in the adrenal cortex. Such a deficiency would result in no obvious phenotypic effects in a male fetus. However, a genotypic female may be born with ambiguous or masculinized genitalia due to the presence of excess cortical sex hormone. Males can be affected by similar disorders if they lead to excessive production of estrogens. Makes sense. Getting too much of the wrong hormone is going to have phenotypic effects. All right. Adrenal medulla. Nestled inside the adrenal cortex is the adrenal medulla. So far, we've been in the adrenal cortex. Now in the adrenal medulla, a derivative of the nervous system, this organ is responsible for the production of the sympathetic hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. The specialized nerve cells in the medulla are capable of secreting these compounds directly into the circulatory system. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine are amino acid derivative hormones that belong to a larger class of molecules known as catecholamines. Acid, meaning amino acid derivative. They are in a class called catecholamines. Much like the sympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system, the hormones released from the adrenal medulla affect a wide variety of systems in the body, and all of their effects are centered on the fight or flight response. Epinephrine can increase the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, glucogenolysis. Let's write that down. It can cause glycogenolysis glycogen to glucose in both liver and muscle, in the liver and in muscle, as well as increase the basal metabolic rate. Increase the breakdown of glycogen and increase basal metabolic rate. Both hormones will increase heart rate, dilate the bronchi, and alter blood flow to supply the systems that would be used in a sympathetic response. That is, there is vasodilation of blood vessels leading to the skeletal muscle, heart, and lungs, and brain, increasing blood flow to these organs. Concurrently, vasoconstriction decreases blood flow to the gut, kidneys, and skin. Note that the stress response involves both cortisol and epinephrine. Classically, cortisol is thought of as being important for long-term slow stress responses, while catecholamines are thought of as being important for short-term fast stress responses. Note, however, the cortisol actually increases the synthesis of catecholamines as well, resulting in an increase in catecholamine release. So that's a little bit of positive feedback. It's not to the same thing, though. It's not stimulating more cortisol, it's actually stimulating catecholamines. All right. Stress equals cortisol plus epinephrine, and we think of cortisol as the slow and epinephrine as the fast. cortisol, though, is, we learned, steroid, right? I believe we learned that it was a steroid hormone. Let's double check. I don't remember where that went. Cortisol, cortisol. It's glucocorticoid. Means they're steroid. Right. Corticosteroids are steroids, while catecholamines are amino acid derived. And that makes sense because it's got amine in the name. So it's amino acid. Amino. All right. All right. The pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. Let's go on to the pancreas. That didn't work. Pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine. What's exocrine? Exocrine tissues secrete substances directly into ducts. The pancreas produces a number of digestive enzymes, as discussed in Chapter 9. From an endocrine standpoint, small clusters of hormone-producing cells are grouped together into islets of Langerhans throughout the pancreas. As shown in Figure 5.10, islets contain 3 distinct types of cells, alpha, beta, and delta. Each cell type secretes a different hormone. Alpha secretes glucagon, beta secretes insulin, and delta secretes somatostatin. All right. So exocrine specifically means secrete into ducts. I mean, I don't know what that means. I don't know why that's significant. Pancreas produces a number of digestive enzymes. Islets of Langerhans contain alpha, beta, and delta cells, which make glucagon. Insulin and somatostatin. Glucagon is secreted during times of fasting. When glucose levels run low, the secretion of glucagon stimulates degradation of protein and fat, conversion of glycogen to glucose, and production of new glucose via gluconeogenesis. In addition to low blood glucose concentrations, certain gastrointestinal hormones such as cholecytokinin and gastrin increase glucagon release from alpha cells. When blood glucose concentrations are high, glucagon release is inhibited. So, when blood glucose, if you have low blood glucose, then glucagon will increase it. by degradation of protein and fat, conversion of glycogen, gluconeogenesis. So instead I'm going to write increases blood glucose. Insulin is antagonistic to glucagon and is therefore secreted when blood glucose levels are high. Insulin induces muscle and liver cells to take up glucose and store it as glycogen for later use. In addition, because it is active when glucose levels are high, insulin stimulates anabolic processes such as fat and protein synthesis. So it'll decrease blood glucose. Right, so stimulates anabolic processes. And I guess catabolic processes is making glucose from other things, either proteins or glycogen. So we'll add that this one here is catabolic, while this one here is anabolic. If you have lots of sugar, you don't need more sugar. You could use it to make other stuff. If you don't, then you got to make sugar for the brain. Catabolic, anabolic. What about somatostatin? In excess, insulin will, we're still on insulin. In excess, insulin will cause hypoglycemia, which is characterized by low blood glucose concentration. Underproduction, insufficient secretion, or insensitivity to insulin all can result in diabetes mellitus, which is clinically characterized by hyperglycemia, excess glucose in the blood. In the kidneys, excessive glucose in the filtrate will overwhelm the nephron's ability to reabsorb glucose, resulting in its presence in the urine. Because it is an osmotically active particle and does not readily cross the cell membrane, the presence of glucose in the filtrate leads to excess excretion of water and an increase, that is sometimes quite dramatic, of urine volume. Diabetics often report polyuria, increased frequency of urination, and polydipsia, increased thirst. There are two types of diabetes mellitus. Type 1, insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, is caused by autoimmune destruction of the beta cells of the pancreas. Thus, individuals produce little to no insulin because the majority of beta cells have been destroyed. Type 1 diabetics require regular injections of insulin to prevent hyperglycemia and to permit entry of glucose into cells. So, whoops. Type 1 of diabetes. Beta cell degradation or deficiency. Usually high blood glucose And that will lead to polyuria and polyuria, which is urination, frequent urination, and polydipsia, thirst, increased thirst. Type 2 non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, is the result of receptor level resistance to the effects of insulin. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is partially inherited and partially due to environmental factors, such as high carbohydrate diets and obesity. Certain pharmaceutical agents can be taken orally to help the body more effectively use the insulin it produces. These individuals require insulin only when their body can no longer control glucose levels, even when aided by their medications. So let's put in type 2 is receptor level insulin resistance. So whereas type 1 is an insulin deficiency, type 2 is insulin resistance. Somatostatin is an inhibitor of both insulin and glucagon secretion. High blood glucose and amino acid concentrations stimulate its secretion. Somatostatin is also produced by the hypothalamus, where it functions to decrease growth hormone secretion in addition to its effects on insulin and glucagon. So, increases blood glucose, decreases blood glucose. Somatostatin inhibits both. Let's put all right, so it's an inhibitor of both. Gonads. Because reproductive endocrinology is discussed in detail in Chapter 2, we offer only a brief overview in this chapter. The testes secrete testosterone in response to stimulation by gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Gonads. Testes. LH and FSH cause testosterone. Testosterone causes sexual differentiation of the male during gestation and also promotes the development and maintenance of secondary sex characteristics in males, such as axillary and pubic hair, deepening of the voice, and muscle growth. The ovaries secrete estrogen in response to the gonadotropins. Estrogen is involved in development of the female reproductive system during gestation and also promotes the development and maintenance of secondary sex characteristics in females, such as axillary and pubic hair, breast growth, and body fat redistribution. These two steroid hormones also govern the menstrual cycle as well as pregnancy. Pineal gland. Pineal. Pineal gland is located deep within the brain, where it secretes the hormone melatonin. The precise mechanism of this hormone is unclear, although it has been demonstrated to be involved in circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythm. I messed up. Let's do that again. Circadian rhythm. All right. Blood levels of melatonin are at least partially responsible for the sensation of sleepiness. The pineal gland receives projections directly from the retina, but is not involved in vision. It is hypothesized that the pineal gland responds to decreases in light intensity by releasing melatonin. So, when people talk about the pineal gland being the third eye, in some ways it is the third eye. Not some kind of internal site, but specifically your sensitivity to light that causes melatonin to be secreted, your circadian rhythm. When your pineal gland detects light, it will, I think, inhibit melatonin, and that's reversed in the absence of light. Other organs, in addition to the organs listed above, specific cells and tissues and other organs are capable of endocrine signaling. In the gastrointestinal tract, endocrine tissue can be found in both the stomach and intestine. Many gastrointestinal peptides have been identified. Important ones include secretin, gastrin, and cholecystokinin. The specific functions of these hormones are discussed in Chapter 9. But as we might expect for the digestive system, the stimulus for release of most of these peptides is the presence of specific nutrients. So let's go other. You got your gut. We'll make secretin, gastrin, and cholecystokinin. The kidneys play a role in water balance. As mentioned earlier, ADH increases water permeability in the collecting duct, and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system increases sodium and water reabsorption in the distal, convoluted, tubule, and collecting duct. The kidneys also produce erythropoietin, which stimulates bone marrow to increase production of erythrocytes, red blood cells. It is secreted in response to low oxygen levels in the blood. Nice. Kidney. Erythropoietin. Stimulates the production of erythrocytes, or red blood cells. The heart releases natriuretic The heart releases natriuretic peptide to help regulate salt and water balance. When cells in the atria are stretched from excess blood volume, they release ANP. This hormone promotes excretion of sodium and therefore increases urine volume. Promotes excretion of sodium, but I thought that water follows the sodium. So this is absorption into the blood, right? This effect is functionally antagonistic to aldosterone because it lowers blood volume and pressure and has no effect on blood osmolarity. No, it is the opposite. Okay, this is out of the body, excreted out of the body. I don't understand why it would have the opposite effect, right? Like aldosterone also increases blood volume. Right? Aldosterone lowers or increases blood volume by absorption of sodium. And this is saying that ANP decreases blood volume by the same mechanism, by salt, by salt excretion. Oh no, excretion. So, all right, in the sense of absorption, we're taking salt. In this case, we're getting rid of salt. But yeah, getting rid of salt has the same effect on water. How can that be? I'm not sure I understand that. We'll have to review. But from the horse's mouth, the heart makes atrial natriuretic peptide. If anyone can explain to me why aldosterone decreases salt in the blood, or increases salt in the blood, increasing its water volume, while ANP decreases blood volume by getting rid of salt, or how it also increases blood volume. Oh no, it lowers blood volume and pressure. Never mind. That makes sense. My bad. I don't know why I'm getting confused. I guess it's the word excretion and absorption. But no, this makes sense. Absorption of salt into the blood is going to cause the blood volume to go up, and if ANP is antagonistic to that system, then it will excrete sodium, decreasing blood volume. Great. All right. My bad. It's got a little confused there. The thymus, located directly behind the sternum, releases thymosin, which is important for proper T cell development. And differentiation. The thymus atrophies by adulthood, and thymosin levels drop accordingly. The function of T cells is discussed in Chapter 8. All right. Low in adults. Just like testosterone is low in adults. Makes sense. We're almost done. I just wanted to make sure that I wrote down. So I got the beta cells here. Wasn't there's something that I wanted to put in there about the bone? Because I thought that was interesting. Where was it? It was here. It was No, we're good. I'm getting confused with beta cells, and like C cells are not the same as B cells. Beta cells are not the same as B cells. Here we got T cells. All right, we got a nice chart of all the hormones that we've talked about. A full list of hormones and their actions, including all the ones we've gone through except for progesterone. We didn't specifically go over progesterone, did we? Promotes maintenance of the endometrium. We went over that in chapter 2. We got the corticoids. All right. Let's answer some questions. For each of the hypothalamic releasing hormones listed below, what hormone does each affect in the anterior pituitary? On which organ does each pituitary hormone act? What hormones are released by the target organs? So let's just go back up here to where we got this, because I don't quite have it committed to memory yet. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. Comes from the hypothalamus. That causes luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone to be produced in the anterior pituitary, which will then go to the gonads, which would then release either testosterone or estrogen. The corticotropin releasing factor from the hypothalamus causes ACTH, the adrenal corticotropic hormone, to be released by the anterior pituitary, which then targets the adrenal glands, which then make cortisol, as well as, was it epinephrine and norepinephrine? Thyroid, adrenal cortex makes a few hormones. It's going to make your glucocorticoids, mineral corticoids, and cortical sex hormones. No, that's corticosteroids. Are these all made by the cortex? These are, aren't they? Or these are just examples of corticosteroids? I guess the cortisol and cortisone. So the adrenal cortex will make both cortisol and cortisone. It'll make the... what else does it make? Let's see here. I guess it makes mineral corticoids like aldosterone, but that is not from ACTH, is it? That's due to sensing blood osmolarity and volume. So in this sense, coming from CRF, it's specifically ACTH in the pituitary, and then cortisol and cortisone in the adrenal cortex. Thyroid releasing hormone in the hypothalamus will cause, what was TSH? What did that stand for again? Thyroid stimulating hormone in the adrenal, or the anterior pituitary. I decided that I wasn't going to remember what AP meant. Let's actually write. Anterior pituitary. Which makes T4 and T3, tridothyronine and thyroxine, as well as calcitronin in the thyroid. Dopamine, we learned, was the same as Oxytocin? No, not oxytocin. It is the same as what was it? Oxytocin, positive feedback. Dopamine, oxytocin. Oh, PIF. What was that? The something inhibiting factor? Let's look it up. The prolactin inhibiting, right? So dopamine from the anterior pituitary will cause prolactin in, I believe, PIF in the hypothalamus, prolactin in the pituitary, posterior pituitary, not anterior this time. The posterior pituitary will make your ADH and oxytocin. Is that right? Prolactin. There's no target organ. The target organ is the pituitary. No. Hormones from the pituitary, target organ. The target organ is what actually makes the prolactin. Growth hormone release, or dopamine from the hypothalamus causes causes prolactin in the pituitary. Dopamine prevents prolactin, which causes milk production. So prolactin, inhibiting prolactin causes milk production. Is that correct? Let's double check this. Prolactin stimulates milk production. We don't have the dopamine part. We don't have the PIF part of it. All right. We'll check the answers in a second and see what they say. Growth hormone releasing hormone in the hypothalamus causes growth hormone in the pituitary. And that's it. Which two hormones are primarily involved in calcium homeostasis? And what effect do they have on concentrations? Well, calcium. C cells. Calciphonin. Parafollicular hormone causes calciphonin. as well as the parathyroid hormone is the antagonist to calcitronin. So calcitonin will decrease calcium. Parathyroid hormone will do the opposite, increase calcium. Which endocrine tissue synthesizes catecholamines? What are the two main catecholamines it produces? Catecholamines are amino acid derivative, adrenal gland. Which two pancreatic hormones are the? Oh wait, sorry, that's the wrong one. What endocrine tissue synthesizes catecholamines? It's got to be the adrenal medulla, I guess specifically. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are made by the adrenal medulla. Yeah, not the adrenal cortex, at least. I don't know if I said that earlier, but. And the two main catecholamines it produces are, I guess, epinephrine and norepinephrine, or would it be epinephrine and cortisol? Yeah, epinephrine and cortisol, right? Or is it just epinephrine and norepinephrine? Whereas cortisol is made by the adrenal cortex? Yeah, cortisol and cortisone are adrenal cortex, while the adrenal medulla is just going to be your epinephrine and norepinephrine, I think. All right, which two pancreatic hormones are the major drivers of glucose homeostasis? Where does each come from, and what effect does each have on blood glucose concentrations? Pancreatic hormones that affect glucose, glucagon and insulin primarily. Glucagon will increase blood glucose, insulin will decrease blood glucose. Which three hormones are primarily involved in water homeostasis? Whoops. So we're looking for those blood volume, H2O in blood. Mineral corticoids, aldosterone, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Yeah, I'm going to go with aldosterone. Or specifically renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. Okay. Let's check those. Make sure we're accurate. Going to add GnRH makes FSH and LH, which makes testosterone and progesterone. CRF, ACTH, cortisol, cortisone. TRH, TSH, T3, T4. Dopamine makes prolactin, and the target tissue is the breast. GHRH makes growth hormone, and its target is bone and muscle. So I guess I didn't say that breast tissue is targeted here and the bone and muscles are targeted here. Note that a decrease in dopamine from the hypothalamus promotes prolactin secretion. That's why they got a little asterisk on that. Calcitonin from the parafollicular C cells of the thyroid decrease blood calcium concentration. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium. The adrenal medulla makes your catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine. Glucagon from the A cells of the pancreas increase blood glucose. Insulin decreases blood glucose. Is that what I said? Yeah, I think so. Up, down, right. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH or vasopressin, from the hypothalamus increase blood volume and decrease blood osmolarity. Aldosterone from the adrenal cortex increases blood volume and no effect on osmolarity. And atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, from the heart decreases blood volume with no effect on osmolarity. So I forgot about that. I just said aldosterone along with its precursors, which they're not counting. They're talking about ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, aldosterone, and ANP from the heart. Forgot about that. All right. Discrete practice questions. Which of the following associations between a hormone and its category is incorrect? Aldosterone and mineralocorticoids, testosterone and cortical sex hormones, ADH and mineralocorticoids, or cortisone and glucocorticoids. Aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, and cortisol is a glucocorticoid. Testosterone is a cortical sex hormone. Oh, androgens and estrogens. Yeah, androgen is testosterone, right? Cortical sex hormone. So the only one I think that isn't right is ADH is a mineralocorticoid. I don't think so. ADH is peptide, or let's go up to the anterior pituitary. Let's go up here to look for ADH. Where was ADH? Vasopressin, posterior pituitary. All right. Yeah, I'm going to go with ADH, mineralocorticoid 1C. 2. Which of the following hormones directly stimulates a target tissue that is not an endocrine organ? LH and GH do. ACTH. Well, I guess it was this little chart, huh? Target organ for TSH, the thyroid, which is an endocrine organ. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, which I also call part of the endocrine. LH and GH. Oh, not LH and FSH. LH stimulates the gonads. Do you call gonads part of the endocrine system? You do. GH is the growth hormone that affects bone and muscle. So that's the one that's not endocrine. So 2 is going to be GH. D. 3. Increased synthetic activity of the parathyroid glands would lead to the parathyroid hormone, which does the opposite of calcitonin, And so it'll increase calcium in the blood. An increase in renal calcium reabsorption. A decrease in the rate of bone resorption. It'll be the opposite of these. It'll be decrease in calcium storage, which means increase in resorption means not storage, right? Or resorption does mean storage. Reabsorption versus resorption. Decreased bone resorption, a decrease in basal metabolic rate. Does it affect metabolic rate? A decrease in blood glucose concentration. Increased synthetic activity would lead to reabsorption is the opposite of excretion. So that is correct. And a decrease in the rate of bone resorption. Increased secretion means decreased reabsorption. This will increase reabsorption. Oh man, I'm getting confused already. The second time on this one. A decrease in the rate of bone resorption. I feel like both these A and B are correct, because they both result in less less calcium in the blood, right? An increase in renal calcium reabsorption. A decrease in the rate of bone resorption. A decrease in metabolic rate and a decrease in blood glucose concentration. I feel like A and B can both be true. I'm going to go with calcium resorption. Reabsorption, rather. But I really don't know between A and B. So I'm just going to guess A. 4. Which of the following statements concerning growth hormone is not true? Overproduction of growth hormone in adults results in acromegaly. That's true. Promotes growth of bone and muscle. Yes, it is produced by the hypothalamus, but secreted by the pituitary. That's not quite right. GRGH is made in the hypothalamus, but GH is made in the pituitary, right? So it's got to be C. A childhood deficiency in growth hormone results in dwarfism. That makes sense, yep. 4, C. 5. Iodine deficiency may result in I don't know what galactorrhea is, but cretinism? Did we learn about cretinism? Doesn't that sound right? Cretinism, developmental delay, is because of... Did I not write down why? Iodine? Yeah, iodine is the thyroid hormones. So yeah, not enough iodine will mean not enough thyroid hormones. So hypothyroidism or developmental delay. It's not hyperthyroidism. So it wouldn't be gigantism. I don't know what galactorrhea is, but 5's got to be B. 6, a patient with a very high TSH level. Which of the following would not cause a high TSH level? Let's review TSH, thyroid releasing hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Autoimmune destruction of thyroid cells that produce T3 and T4. Which of the following would not cause a high TSH level? Would autoimmune destruction of thyroid T3 and T4 cells cause increased TSH? If it has a negative feedback loop that is prevented, let's double check that that feedback was negative. Yeah, there is negative feedback. So I think that would be correct. A tumor in the hypothalamus that secretes high levels of TRH. High TRH will mean high TSH, so that makes sense. High levels of T4 from thyroid replacement medications. If you have a lot of T4, that would negatively, because of the negative feedback, that would decrease the level of TSH. So I don't think C is correct. So C must be the answer. Which one is not responsible? Cancerous growth of parafollicular cells in the thyroid, destroying other cell types in the organ. And remind me what parafollicular... C cells, parafollicular, calcitonin. So I guess it doesn't matter that it's calcitonin. It's just that cancerous growth of these cells will affect other cell types in the organ, is what it says, like follicular. So D also works. The one that does not increase TSH has got to be C. 6. C. 7. Which of the following hormones is not derived from cholesterol? Aldosterone, progesterone, estrogen, oxytocin. I want to say oxytocin. Remind me what oxytocin is. You know what? We have a chart of all of them, don't we? Let's just peek at that real quick. We're not expected to memorize it, have it already memorized, right? What do we say? Estrogen is steroid. So 7. Aldosterone. There you go. Is mineral corticoid, which is steroid. Aldosterone, steroid. Estrogen, steroid. Oxytocin, peptides. It's got to be oxytocin. Progesterone, Steroid. Oxytocin is the peptide hormone. C. 8. Which of the following is true regarding pancreatic somatostatin? Its secretion is increased by low blood glucose. It is always inhibitory. It is regulated by cortisol levels. It stimulates insulin and glucagon secretion. Let's double check. Somatostatin inhibits glucagon and insulin. Secretion being... I don't think that's true. Is it always inhibitory? Yes. It inhibits both glucagon and insulin, it says. It is regulated by cortisol levels. That also, I don't think so. I think it's glucose, right? Blood glucose. It stimulates insulin and glucagon secretion. That's also false. So I think the true one is that it's inhibitory, B. 9. Which of the following is false regarding aldosterone regulation? Renin converts the plasma protein angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Let's double check that. We wrote this. Renin I don't think so. I think Alright, so the kidney makes renin, which stimulates angiotensin. Does it actually turn angiotensin into angiotensin 1? Or angiotensinogen? Let's double check. So to secrete renin, which cleaves an inactive plasma protein angiotensin into angiotensin 1. So I should maybe in the same way that I'm referring to this process, this is referring to this process. All right. What did I just look up? I'm blanking out. I think I was looking at the wrong thing. Destruction of all beta cells. It's true regarding somatostatin. It's inhibitory. Did I go off to 10 without doing 9? I think so. Okay. Destruction of all beta cells in the pancreas would cause glucagon secretion to stop and an increase in blood glucose concentration. I think the beta cells were insulin, right? Insulin secretion to stop and an increase in blood glucose concentration, because insulin will lower the concentration. C. 10. Now we're on 10. Which of the following is false regarding aldosterone regulation? Renin converts plasma protein angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Correct. In angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. That doesn't sound right. Aldosterone is in the... Oh, it is, in the adrenal. Is it the cortex? Sure, we'll just give them the benefit of the doubt. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. Correct. A decrease in blood oxygen concentration stimulates renin production. Decreased blood pressure causes renin production, not oxygen concentration. So we'll go with 10D is false. A scientist discovers a new hormone that is relatively large in size and triggers the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. Which of the following best describes the type of hormone that was discovered? So I remember a picture I feel like shows this. Maybe not. I feel like it was one of the first charts. It was the one that showed, all right, the signaling in the cell. ATP to cyclic AMP. It is adenylate cyclase that does this. So, adenylate cyclase? A hormone that is large in size and triggers the conversion of ATP. So, what affects the G protein again? Is it any peptide hormone? Just a peptide hormone? Because this was under peptide hormones. Yeah. So just any peptide hormone. 11B. Great. 12. A patient presents with muscle weakness, slow movement, and calcium deposits in his tissues. A blood test reveals very low calcium levels in the blood. Administration of which of the following would be an appropriate in treatment for the blood test findings? Low blood calcium. Calcitonin will increase secretion, so it'll decrease blood calcium. Parathyroid will increase blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone should increase calcium. 12B. Let's go with B. 13. Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are peptide hormones produced and released by the pituitary, steroid hormones produced and released by the pituitary, peptide hormones produced by the hypothalamus and released to the pituitary, or steroid hormones produced by the hypothalamus and released to the pituitary. Oxytocin was not steroid hormone. It was a peptide hormone. So peptide produced by the hypothalamus or pituitary. I'd say pituitary. nothing's produced by the hypothalamus but released by the pituitary, right? Like the pituitary makes its own things. Either the hypothalamus stimulates it by nerves or by another hormone that acts on the pituitary. So, first one, peptide hormone produced and released by the pituitary. 13A. Let's double check that it is peptide. I think that's what we saw a moment ago. Maybe I was looking at estrogen though. Is it oxytocin? Is peptide. Hypothalamus, released by posterior pituitary. It does say that it comes from the hypothalamus. Produced and released by the pituitary. I want to say A, even though they make it seem like the source is the hypothalamus. That's the source as far as signaling, but not chemically. It's not. I don't think it's being made in the hypothalamus. We'll see in a minute when we check these answers. 14. Excessive levels of dopamine in the brain are associated with psychosis. Accordingly, many antipsychotic medications block dopamine receptors. Which of the following effects may be seen in an individual taking antipsychotics? Increased secretion of growth hormone, decreased secretion of growth hormone, increased secretion of prolactin, decreased secretion of prolactin. We learned that dopamine inhibits prolactin, so less dopamine means more prolactin, increased secretion of prolactin. C. 15. A genotypical female infant is born with ambiguous genitalia. Soon after birth, she suffers from hyponatremia, or low blood concentrations of sodium. Which endocrine organ is most likely to be affected? So ambiguous genitalia are those cortical sex hormones, which are made by the adrenal cortex. Low blood concentration of sodium, aldosterone, also adrenal cortex. It's got to be the adrenal cortex D. All right, let's see how we did. 1, C, 2, D, 3, A, 4, C, 5, B, 6, C, 7, C, 8, B, 9, C, 10, D, 11, B, 12, B, 13, C, not A. Both oxytocin and vasopressin, another name for antidiuretic hormone, end with the suffix "in." This should hint that they are peptide or amino acid derivative hormones. These two hormones are both synthesized by the hypothalamus but released by the posterior pituitary. Remember that the posterior pituitary does not actually synthesize any hormones itself. Rather, it contains the axons of cells originating in the hypothalamus and is the site of release for these hormones. So we were wrong, but that's still, I'm not sure that makes sense. Axons of nerve cells, what do they have to do with transporting hormones? I mean, it's not, right? It's that like, I don't know, if one of you guys can tell me the actual mechanism, the specifics of this mechanism, I'd love to hear it. All right. 14, C, 15, D. Not bad. We'll have to revisit this. So it contains axon cells from the hypothalamus and is the site of release. That doesn't mean that the axon is what's transporting those hormones. There's some other transport mechanism. Well, now you know. Posterior pituitary doesn't make any hormones of its own. Remember that the posterior pituitary does not actually synthesize any hormones itself. All right. Well, that is it for the endocrine system. Next time, the respiratory system. Thanks for watching. See you next time.